Welcome, dear readers. You're listening to Time to Read, a Winnipeg Public Library podcast book club. We're recording today from the Carol Shields Auditorium at the Millennium Library in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is within Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininew, and Dakota peoples, and in the National Homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. In this episode, we will be discussing Rules of Civility by Amor Towles. I'm Dennis from the Idea Mill, and I'm sure as the shore, except I'm not sure how sure the shore actually is. Across the table from me is...
I'm Toby. I'm an outreach librarian based out of here at Millennium Library, and I hope that we can abide by the 35th rule in young George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. Let your discourse with men of business be short and comprehensive. And across the table from me is...
Hi, I'm Trevor, and I'm the branch head at the Louis Riel Library, 1974-?
Good book can carry me away from an average and ordinary day, yeah. So keep it down, leave me alone, close the doors and turn off the phone, 'cause all I ever really need is a little more time to read.
And you, dear readers, we wouldn't do this without you. How about you swing by and knock on our door so we can talk about the books we're reading? Or maybe just send us an email instead. You can find our email address and all our social media outlets by going to wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca and scrolling to the bottom of the page. Hang around till the end of the episode to enjoy our most remarkable segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds. Before we proceed further, let's check in with the panel. How you guys doing?
Good.
Yes, also good. Realize, well,
very articulate.
I sometimes before we start recording, we kind of have a pre-discussion about, do we have anything we want to talk about and stuff? And well, we spent the time talking about other things.
True.
Unrelated maybe to the world of books and libraries.
Yeah. So you guys don't have anything?
I have nothing.
The rules of civility would suggest that we don't blather on about things we don't have anything to say about. I made that up.
Okay.
I'm sure there's something along those lines in there.
Well, then I will share that I already achieved my book reading resolution.
What?
Because I finished off that series by N.K. Jemisin that we had started last time.
No, that doesn't count, I don't think. Because you
it counts.
No, because I
it
think
counts.
you have
It's a fantasy epic series.
But you didn't start it in 2025.
Yes, so...
I feel... Okay.
But anyway,
I'm going to give it to you.
Because I started so early, I am planning to still add another series in there.
I feel better about that.
That'll help assuage you. But I will just say I was delighted to complete the series, and this is the first time in a long time that I have read a trilogy. So it was really nice. I felt like it awakened some of my excitement of reading again, because I haven't been reading as much the last bunch of years.
Well, I'd like to have a discussion once we all get through all three books. It'd be fun because there's things that happen later on that are worth talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Are books 2 and 3 as good as book 1?
Yes.
Okay.
I will say there's like a little bit about the end that I would have liked to have been slightly different, but I'm nitpicking because it held up really well, and I can understand why they all won an award. And why people like the trilogy as a whole. It delivers on so much that it started with. A lot of those questions get answered we had from the first one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so that's my check-in. And if that's all we've got, Toby's going to tell us about the author, after which Trevor will give us a summary of the book.
Okay, Amor Towles. He was born in 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. He started writing in first grade. At 10, he threw a bottle with a message in it into the Atlantic Ocean. He received a reply from Harrison Salisbury, the managing editor of the New York Times, who found the bottle, and the two corresponded for many years. I couldn't corroborate this information. Like I found it in Wikipedia, and then I found the source it was in, but I couldn't find it anywhere else. So I want it to be true, but it might not be true. It sounds pretty outlandish. Anyway, he graduated from Yale as well as Stanford, where he received a Master of Arts in English. His thesis, a collection of short stories called Temptations of Pleasure, was published in the Paris Review in 1989. At 25, he moved to New York with the intention of being a writer, though discovered it was not very lucrative. Friends started an investment firm, which Towles became a part of in order to earn a living. From 1991 to 2012, he worked at the investment firm, though still long to write. He gave himself a year to write a draft of a novel beginning January 1st, 2006. He finished the first draft of what would become his first novel, Rules of Civility, a year later, though spent the next several years revising it. It was published in 2011 and was longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award and was successful enough that he was able to quit his day job. His second novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, was published in 2016. It was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize and was on the New York Times bestseller list for 59 weeks. It was also made into a TV show starring Ewan McGregor. His third novel, The Lincoln Highway, was published in 2021. It debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and was named the best book of the year by Amazon. His fourth book, a collection of short stories and a novella, Table for Two, was published in 2024. His interests include 1950s jazz music, rock and roll on vinyl, vintage antiques, and fine art. His favorite books are 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, War and Peace by Tolstoy, and Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And he lives in Manhattan with his wife and his 2 children.
Mm-hmm. Those best book picks sounds like something an AI would pick.
I know, right?
If you were, it's like, come on. Yeah. I have tried and actually have read Moby Dick.
Me too.
Yeah. It's a slog.
Oh, yeah. There's like 50 pages just talking about various kinds of whales.
Yeah, and how to kill them. Well, he sounds like the type of guy that would know about New York society.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
And speaking about New York society, this is my summary of the novel we're about to discuss. So, Rules of Civility is set in 1930s New York City, and it's a remembrance of 1 year in Katie Content's life. Katie is a sharp and independent young woman, a native New Yorker, working as a secretary at a publishing firm. The story begins on New Year's Eve in 1938, or I guess it's New Year's Eve 1937, but it's 1938 is the year that this book takes place in. When Katie and her best friend Evie meet Tinker Gray, a charming and wealthy banker with a mysterious vibe. Over the course of the novel, Katie's life becomes intertwined with Tinker's, as well as with Evie's, who is a beautiful and ambitious woman, originally from Indiana, who is more willing than Katie to pursue social climbing. Tinker becomes the central figure in Katie's life, embodying the allure and challenges of wealth and status, as his past and motivations are slowly revealed. As Katie and Evie navigate the social and romantic dynamics of New York's elite circles, Katie also grapples with her own dreams and desires. Throughout the novel, Katie's intelligence and resilience are tested by the complexities of love, friendship, and the choices that define a person's future. The reader is invited to explore themes of class conflict, the illusions of glamour, and the impact of pivotal moments in one's life, all while showcasing the character's personal growth against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world. Rules of Civility.
Mm-hmm. Well, how did you find it?
We were waiting for that. Well, you both know I'm an Amor Towles stan. Having read this book, I'm now a completist. I've now read all of his books.
Oh, you hadn't read this one before?
I haven't read this one before.
If only that was your resolution.
But, especially compared to his other books, I found this book a little boring. I liked it when the character of Eve was around, but as soon as she left the narrative and took off to LA, it just wasn't the same. Like, I really liked the friendship between her and Katie, and once that was gone, there wasn't a ton to hold my interest. But I mean, it's a good book. There's not a lot to criticize. The writing's good. I think the characters are good. The narrative is straightforward. It's a book that has a lot of style, but it just wasn't a book I looked forward to reading. I wasn't very excited about it.
Well, I made a note saying that where to begin with this sumptuous feast. So I took maybe a slightly more enjoyment out of the book. And my experience with this author is only that I've read The Lincoln Highway, and that was with our Louis Riel book club a few months ago. So it was interesting to read this book, which it was his first one. I felt like it sort of lives and dies by its characters rather than the plot. And so luckily for us, I felt like the characters were, multidimensional, especially Katie, who acts as sort of like the surrogate for the reader to enter this interesting world of 1930s New York. We get to walk in her sensible secretarial shoes for a year. And then we also get to know many of the people that she encounters over those 12 months. And it kind of took turns that I wasn't expecting. Like, for example, the first, couple of chapters, it feels like it's going to be like a love triangle story between Tinker and Eve and Katie. And then spoilers, there's a car accident which leaves Eve quite injured and scarred. And so then the story kind of takes an unexpected turn at that point where it becomes less of a love triangle and more of Katie kind of meeting people and by chance encounters and planned encounters kind of moving up in this world that Towles has created.
Break the tie.
Break the tie?
Yeah.
Well, I found the book enjoyable in a light way. Like, I backed myself up by reading a whole trilogy during the month, so I didn't have as much time to read as I'd like. And then when I was getting ready to read, I had a family member come into town, so I was kind of busy, and I had to read when I had moments, and that's always challenging for me. I often feel like when I'm reading a book, I need to dedicate a certain amount of time to it so I don't lose focus on it and don't lose my place or lose the plot. But I didn't really find that an issue with this one. I stopped and started in the middle of chapters many times, and it didn't throw me off. I think because one thing I don't like in a book is when an author is too much in love with the language and too flowery and such. And I thought that that might be an issue at the beginning of this book because he does have a penchant for flowery terms and, styly quotes and things like that. But he didn't overdo it, so that didn't end up being a problem for me. But there was a lot of stuff that I didn't have to hang on to because I knew he was being stylish and descriptive in ways that I didn't have to keep track of. So I didn't really lose the storyline. Because it's like a slice of life kind of novel, it wasn't really plot dependent. These are just someone's experiences, and they're a way of conveying a lot of other things like the mood of the cities, the historical things, descriptions of culture, things like that. So it turned out to be an easy read for me. And it was light enough that I could read for long stretches and not feel exhausted by it. So I enjoyed it as almost the way you would with like a standard genre novel, which is kind of funny because it's definitely not a standard genre novel. I found the characters interesting. Katie, obviously, because you get into her head and she's a very independent, intellectually strong character, very well read, very interesting to spend time with. And the other characters that she met were all pretty much nice people. Like some people had their edges and such, and everyone kind of had a toughness to them that was like, just after the Depression. But they're still basically kind people for the most part. So there wasn't anything super unpleasant. They're just kind of these little worries like, oh, Evie and Tinker, it's like he's feeling guilty about the car accident. And what if it hadn't happened? And would Katie be with Tinker? And finding out about Anne. And it's like, oh, well, is that bad? It's, So I enjoyed it. It was very pleasant. I won't call it a sumptuous feast necessarily, but I guess I'm a little bit in the middle, but more on Trevor's side, if we're taking sides.
Oh, I with the way you were talking, it kind of sounded like you were more on my side. Like you were just kind of so about this novel.
You're kind of going both ways.
Okay. Well, maybe I was right in the middle then.
Much like Anne Grandin.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Oh, did I just got called an Anne Grandin?
You just got Grandin.
Wow. Yeah, I will say it's like nothing. Like I'm not tempted to read his other novels necessarily because of this one, but I thought it was a fine book.
I thought there were very many similarities style-wise to this book than with Lincoln Highway, which I guess stands to reason because it's the same author, although Lincoln Highway takes place about 10, 15 years after this. I think it's in the early 1950s. But in terms of like a lot of the structure, and in fact, I don't know if you noticed this, Toby, but there's a scene in Rules of Civility where Tinker and Katie go out to Wally's family's kind of hunting lodge. Mm-hmm. I could swear that's the same house from Lincoln Highway that the kids end up in, the one that at the climax.
It's like Wooly's parents' house or something?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And I know they're not the same houses because one is in like upstate New York, and then in Lincoln Highway, I feel like it's maybe in Maine. But the way he's describing it with the stairs, like I feel like he has a definite idea of what a hunting lodge house should look like, and he just basically repurposed it. Because I was like, wait a second, no, those are the bedrooms from Lincoln Highway, or whatever. Another thing I think it's interesting to note is that this book has a framing story at either end of it, where it's actually Katie about 30 years later with her husband, and they attend a art show of photography. And it's a series of photographs of New Yorkers on the subway being snapped anonymously. And she sees two photographs of Tinker Gray taking a year apart, and one where he's looking quite good, another one where it looks like he's been through the ringer. And then, so this whole novel is actually in a way, her remembrance of that year. I mean, it doesn't feel like a remembrance. It's not like she's... Although there are a couple of times where she'll say, "Oh, I don't remember what I had for supper that night, but I remember we stayed up all night and talked and stuff." So again, that sometimes I felt if the language was a little flowery, that maybe that's her way of remembering. Even if they didn't actually talk that way, it's the way that we kind of think people from the 1930s talked, like very kind of witty and like a Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn banter. I don't know if people really talked like that. Maybe just in the movies and maybe in Katie's memory. But I thought that was kind of a clever kind of way to encase the story in a particular place and time, that it kind of removes it a bit from the actual straight ahead. You know that everything's going to turn out okay for her, I guess.
Yeah, and you also know that she doesn't end up with Tinker.
Yes.
So there's no mystery about will they, won't they? Because they won't in any long-term way.
Yeah. And I was like, had an eagle eye out to see if Valentine ever does appear. And of course he does, just in a very small scene. And I was like, there he is. And then I kind of filed that away. And then of course he comes in later. And
when you get to that scene too, I don't know if you experienced it the same way I did. I was like, and then Valentine, like, Valentine? Yeah. What happens now?
Yeah.
Oh, they ignore each other. Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay. So is this the same Val? And then later on, it's confirmed that, that's the same one. So that was kind of funny because it was a little bit of, got your hopes up for a second to see what was going to happen. And it's like, oh, not now.
it always reminded me of the opening scene and when Harry met Sally, when they drive along and they leave and they part as enemies, but they eventually, of course, spoilers for a 40-year-old movie, they get together in the end.
Yeah. So who's your favorite character out of this? I mean, maybe besides Katie, since she was the audience surrogate.
There were all these characters. I think that's what I was talking about, was a sumptuous feast. It was like a smorgasbord of people I'd like to hang out with. I think Wally was my personal favorite, maybe the most sympathetic. Katie was upfront about her feelings towards him. She never thought he was more than just sort of like a practice boyfriend, but I really feel like he felt something for her. Although if he really did, why did he go off to Spain? Except that maybe he felt like he needed to do something, right? Like all these characters in this year were making choices about trying to find their true selves. And in Wally's case, I think he kind of inherited the paper business and he, was living the life of a socialite without ever really feeling like it suited him. I don't know.
Yeah, that was the impression I got too. It's just he didn't feel like he deserved what he had. Because he had worked hard, but he hadn't really earned what he had in his mind and thought he should go do something hard, something in line with his morals and kind of get something back there for himself. So he felt like he deserved something that he had. And
if I'm sure his intention was to survive that experience and to return to the States and maybe be a different, better person or something.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
One thing I really felt in this book, like you meet all these characters and like in Katie's case, we're right in her head for the bulk of it, but I didn't feel like I really, really knew any of them at the end of it. Everyone had shields up and maybe that's supposed to, represent the times, again, with coming out of the Depression, everyone had been toughened up in order to survive difficulties. Most of the characters didn't have any patience for any softness from other people, And so I kind of felt like there were a lot of things that people did that you didn't know exactly why. You had to take a guess at it, but they weren't as open as other characters in novels that I read.
And I think maybe that's why I liked Wally, because I think of all the characters, I felt he let his guard down around Katie more than maybe any of the other characters. I made a note of Tinker's apartment, the Beresford, and its slogan, which translates into place no trust in appearances. And I thought that's a good sort of almost like summary theme of many of the characters, that they're all playing a role or they're all playing multiple roles.
Well, that's especially funny considering that the Beresford was Tinker's apartment, except we find out later it was Anne's apartment.
Yeah.
It's right there. Don't trust appearances. This isn't what it seems to be.
Yeah.
Although, what about Hank, Tinker's brother, the artist? You kind of get what he's very different from everyone. He's kind of rough around the edges. He says what he means, means what he says.
I'm not sure he does.
No,
he struck me as a contrarian.
Oh, okay.
Because, like, when he's talking with Katie, he's kind of running down his brother Tinker a bit, right? He trashes him a bit. He's like, But then when Katie later on is kind of trashing Tinker, then suddenly Hank is like, oh, maybe you're viewing him too rough. Like, he suddenly starts defending him. Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like Hank is the type of person that no matter what you say, he's going to come and contradict you.
So maybe it's a case of, I can run down my own brother, but you can't.
Yeah.
That sometimes...
It could be.
Is that dynamic? Yeah, Hank.
I really like that scene when Katie and her friend run into them at the bar and they're having a talk, and it sounds like they're talking about boxing or something very machismo, and they're talking about art.
Yeah.
That was just an analogy.
Well, and the other thing about Hank, too, is that, like, when he starts running down Tinker, we have a different opinion of Tinker, too, right? That we don't really know all that's going on with him and his appearances. And by the end of the book, I'm a little bit more on Hank's side. Like, yeah, Tinker is like living a lie and being manipulated and also manipulating. And he kept trying to get Tinker to reconsider what he was doing, trying to find his true self, which in the end, Tinker kind of does. He kind of goes off, and that's why I like the idea of those two photographs of Tinker that are in the gallery at the beginning. One, he's all put together and charming, well-dressed. The other one looks like he's just living on the streets. And yet it's that photo where he looks alive. And that's the one that's taken after. It's the later of the two photos. I think, that's because he is actually now living.
Or maybe he's just feeling more true to himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of made that how to be happy, right? Mm-hmm. Can you be happy? Like, a lot of people will pursue money and fame and other things in order to be happy, but does it make you happy? Can you be happier with less? And for some people, that answer is absolutely yes.
It's kind of in contrast to another character that we meet later on in the book, Dickie Vanderweil, who comes across as this kind of good time Charlie. He knows everybody. He's always about parties and having a good time and, shirking responsibilities. And then he ends up moving to Texas, I think, at the very end. Remember, there's like a little summary of all the characters, and it kind of settles down. I think he goes to business school. He kind of ages out of his funness. He's the opposite Tinker, where he goes from being like, just enjoying himself to being kind of a work-a-day kind of guy, and Tinker goes the other way. Maybe? I don't know.
He was my favorite character, actually.
Dickie?
Really?
Dickie. Huh. Yeah, because, when you're introduced to him, he is this lovable putz, right? He's a fun guy. He wants to do fun things. But he also wasn't like, that type of person can be overbearing, but he didn't come across like that. He came across as genuinely wanting people around him to be enjoying themselves. He was kind to people. And crucially, when he was talking to Katie, and he suddenly he noticed, it's like, well, and how do you feel about Tinker? And because they've been dating, right? He's enjoying being with her, but then he's like, oh, there's something else here, right? And he talks her through it and essentially helps her realize that maybe she still wants to spend time with Tinker. And it was just a lovely little moment where he's been a fun guy, but also when the moment comes, he can be serious and he can be your confidant and he can tell you something honestly, not to his own benefit. And then later on, his dad's trying to teach him a lesson, makes him do this and that and like work in the oil fields. And then he finds a thing that he wants to do. You know what? I am going to button down and work at this. And then he sets himself up a life.
Do you think he's happy though?
Yeah, that was my impression from that. It's like he finally saw what he wanted after goofing around and just enjoying the wealth and privilege that he had. But then he saw, no, this is what, I want to do this now. And then he did it. And I thought that's commendable. Because someone like that can just go off and be a layabout or, a wastrel or whatever else. But he didn't do that. He took responsibility and he worked hard, and that was nice.
And that goes to support what you said earlier about how there are very few villains in this book. That they're just complicated people that maybe are rub up against each other, but don't have any malicious intent. I mean, I don't know what we want to say about Anne.
Or the magazine editor. What's his name?
Oh, Mason Tate.
Yeah, he's kind of villainous.
Well, he's an asshole.
Yeah.
But it seems like he's cultivating that as a style he's doing it for fashion. It almost felt like,
He's like kind of like a devil wears Prada.
For sure.
But I did love that relationship between Katie and Allie, the two kind of assistants. How they're like, Allie took her into the washer and said, "Look, he's going to get rid of one of us. So we're going to work together and we're going to cover for each other, and we're going to make it so that he can't tell which one of us is more helpful to him." And I kind of love that they looked out for each other because they knew the dynamic and they knew that one of them was going to be on the menu.
And the standard thing in that situation is for one of the people to undercut the other.
Right.
Yeah, it's to be catty.
Yeah.
And she flipped that and said, no, we're going to team up and it's going to benefit both of us. And that was nice.
And they both, neither one of them reneged on that.
Yeah.
They both kept that. And he did keep both of them on in the new year, too.
Yeah.
Which I love that. I love those little moments of the book.
Yeah. No, but going back to Anne, since she was a very central figure to all of this, I found her arc kind of fascinating because it wasn't really an arc. It was like this wiggling line that moved around and you weren't sure exactly where it was going. When you first meet her, she's like the godmother.
Right.
Connected with Tinker, looking out for his interests, seemed to be encouraging Katie. And then when it turns out that, well, she was the sugar mama, paying his way, getting him connections and things like that. And of course, Katie didn't know this until she ran into them at the restaurant there by accident. And then afterwards, she's trying to explain herself, which you could take either way. But in the end, it turns out that she was the one who got Katie into that magazine, which ended up being her career and launching her. And she didn't have to do that. Like, she could have been malicious and undercut her easily. Wouldn't have been hard. Katie would have never known. And Katie didn't know that she had helped her. Like, she did that anonymously. So it wasn't to manipulate Katie either.
Yeah.
It's just like she saw something in Katie that she admired and wanted her to continue with and let her go. So in the end, I don't know.
I also appreciated how liberal Anne was, where she was fine if Tinker was in a relationship with Eve, as long as she was getting her little piece. And at the end, when she puts the moves on Katie, it's very open-minded especially for, the 30s.
Yeah. I found her a very nice character, like a very intriguing character.
Yeah, definitely not one-dimensional.
No. There were a lot of dimensions going on.
What'd you think of that scene where Katie goes out for supper by herself and she orders that dish at that French restaurant, La Belle Epoque, and it's like truffles stuffed inside a chicken, and then she gets sick to her stomach, and then there's that older couple that are like looking across the room at her and smiling. Like, do you guys have any thoughts on what that was all about? Was that just sort of be a slice of life of this is what happened in New York in the 30s, or did it make you feel funny, or...
I'd forgotten about that scene,
okay.
And now that you mention it, was there a reason? Like, why did she get sick? Did she see something, or?
I think it was just I can't remember. I thought she just ate all that very rich food, and she was also like treating herself out herself, so she had lots of champagne, and I think that probably also made her feel sick. But then. The older couple were like, "Oh, we like the polka dots on your dress." Like, I kept thinking, like, are they trying to like pick her up for like a threesome? But they were like old, right? Don't
judge Trevor.
No, I know. I mean, but they were really old. But then it turned out, I don't know what was going on. Like, were they just sort of like, Katie was playing the role of the socialite enough that other people in that social strata recognized her as one of them? Because remember, like the wife was like, "Oh yeah, they think that their chicken's the best, but it's horrendous. I can never order it, and we'll give you a ride home in our limousine." And like, it was just like the whole thing was like one of those weird stories that if it happened to you, then the next day you'd be like, "Well, you never believe what happened to me last night," and you tell the story and you'd be like, "Huh. That is weird." But it must be in the book for a reason.
I mean, maybe she was just trying to live above her station and was brought down because she wasn't there yet.
I do think it was it felt to me like a slice of life thing. Like, New York City is another character in the book. A lot of the book talks about how New York is this place where people escape to from wherever they happen to be, and they build an entirely new life there. And this is one of those things. You might mix in circles that maybe you wouldn't otherwise. Things will happen to you that wouldn't have happened any other place, and you just don't know. So that was my feeling of it.
Yeah.
But definitely that does play into the idea that she was going in social circles that maybe she didn't belong in a certain sense, but she was passing. And so she would have these experiences where she is among the wealthy and elite peoples 1 minute, and in the next minute, she's sneaking into a bar and having activities there with down and out painters. And
I did like how she reconnected with Peaches, her pal
yes.
from the boarding house, and how she introduced her to a whole new circle of friends that weren't exactly high society, but super interesting. And it was, I guess, through her that they met Hank, right? In that whole group, the painters.
Yeah,
and things.
that was that introduction. Yeah. A lot of social mixing, which we don't often get to experience in life. Like the only time I've had some real different social mixing in my life was when I went to visit a friend in Yellowknife. And Yellowknife is the type of city where people are there for short periods of time, and you get all kinds of social mixing that don't happen in other places because people are more established. So I appreciated that on that level too. Like there are places you can go and you will experience people that you just don't run into otherwise. It's exciting. Which is why I avoid doing it, because I'm a very boring person and I like a quieter life.
I mean, that reminds me of one of the things that bugged me about this book is that the plot for, what plot there is, it really relies a lot on running into people, the randomness of chance, which I guess is a theme here, but there were so many plot points where it's like, if you hadn't run into this person here, this would have not happened. And if you hadn't run into this person here, this wouldn't have happened. And I was bugged by that because, New York, it's a huge place and there's millions of people. And what are the chances?
Yeah, well, and not all of it was accidental running into people, though. Like when she targeted that publisher, apparently must have been stalking him because she knew a lot about how to approach him.
Yeah, because Evie worked in that publishing house, so she could kind of tell him.
Did Evie work in that publishing house? Was that what I was missing?
That was the connection. Evie worked for that company where that older publisher worked. So that's how, and Katie knew what he looked like, because sometimes when she would meet Evie to go for drinks, he'd be leaving and stuff. So she kind of had him all profiled.
Okay.
So when she went to that restaurant, he was just a sitting duck.
Oh, totally. It's like, she cleverly makes a little comment about Chekhov, which she knew would get his interest, and then she gives an opinion, her own hot take. Yeah. And then she gets to react when he says his name, is like, oh, then you must think me silly. Acknowledging she knows who he is and that he's an expert on this stuff is just so smooth, right? But also so stalkery.
Yeah. Well, also Tinker, like he admitted later, right, that that chance encounter where they had their coffee at the diner, he was waiting for her to come out and saw her go across the street. So some of it wasn't quite as random, but I know what you're saying. There definitely were moments where, like at Wally's hunting club, and then Bitsy was there, and then Bitsy becomes a medium character.
Katie and Bitsy, don't they go for lunch and they see Tinker and Anne, and that's how that whole thing comes out?
Exactly, because Bitsy wants to be fast friends with Katie, and they go. When Katie reveals that she's playing hooky from work, then she says, "Yeah, I know the place to go," and of course that's when it all comes out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is part of life. Like there are a lot of things in life that are arbitrary.
For sure, yeah.
And you can have a tumultuous year where a lot of things happen, which is kind of the point of this one. Like 1938 for Katie was just a wild year that went all over the place and then set the course for the rest of her life.
And I guess all of these characters, they're all in the same circle. They're going to the same restaurants, they're living in the same neighborhoods, they're going to the same bars. So, they're gonna see each other.
That's why go ahead.
And then it was funny too at the end where, Tinker had kind of disappeared, and I think it was Katie was saying like, well, I mean, Manhattan's only so big. Like if he had been here, you'd figure I would have run into him. Mm-hmm. So kind of acknowledging that you can run into anybody at any time, and yet she still hadn't run into Tinker.
Yeah, and I had a hard time with the Venn diagrams of who knows who, because you would think that Tinker and Dickie circles would be kind of overlapping, but I don't think they really knew each other, because Dickie was the sister of someone that Katie was working with at the publishing house. And so I think, Dickie had sort of almost like an equal but separate, or there was that party, right, where Tinker proposed to Evie, and it was all a disaster in the boat. And Dickie was at that party, but they must have known each other.
I think it was most of the one of those situations where they might have had some connect. Well, I mean, Dickie and his group snuck into that party.
Right.
That was
Not the party where Tinker proposed, though. That was a different party.
No, but at the same house.
Right.
Yeah. But when Dickie was at that party the first time at that house, that was because they snuck in.
Right.
So it's not like he was connected to that family directly at that time. He just heard that there was a party there.
Yeah.
As I think he even said, Dickie, do you even know who lives here? Like,
Right. But then that scene that you were describing where Dickie finds Katie at the church and they have that heart-to-heart and Dickie says, how do you feel about Tinker now? Or, I think you're being too hard on this Tinker fellow. Made me think that he doesn't really even know Tinker. And I just assumed they all kind of knew each other. So
yeah, no, I didn't get the impression that they'd actually met.
Yeah. So that kind of almost goes against this randomness thing, that people that are in this kind of the same circles, there's a chance that you don't know each other too, which I guess is reality.
That's happened to me. I've met people who know someone I know, but I don't know them until I met them.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of characters to keep track of. That was the other thing.
I think we talked about pretty much all the major ones.
Not Eve a lot, huh?
No, interesting. We skipped Eve.
Yeah.
So Eve and Katie, both interested in Tinker, having just met him, a little competitive. Mm-hmm. It seemed like it was going Katie's way until the accident, which totally derailed everything. How did you feel about Tinker and Evie's relationship while it was happening?
I felt bad for Tinker. I felt like he was trapped in this relationship. But I found Eve a little strange because, she comes to New York. She refuses her father's money. She wants to make it on her own. But then she wants like a rich boyfriend to take care of her. So I was confused by that. I also think I read Table for Two, which is Amor Towles' most recent book, which has a novella, which is kind of a sequel to Rules of Civility, and it follows the character of Eve as she goes to LA and sort of makes a life for herself there. And because I read that first, I guess I just assumed that Eve was a bigger character in this book, and I wanted more of her. So as I said at the beginning, I was disappointed when she was gone. Because she had main character energy,
Yeah.
But then she left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just found out about that connection to Table for Two like a day ago, so I did want to get your take on it. What was your take on that Even Hollywood story? Does it feel like a good companion to Rules? I know you read them in reverse order, but
yeah, I do want to go back and read Even Hollywood. I remember being confused as to why Eve had a big scar and why she was walking with a limp. So, the mystery of that was solved by reading this. But yeah, it does seem like a good companion. I'm looking forward to going back and rereading it because I'll have more context.
Yeah, I definitely, as soon as I read that, I put Table for Two on hold. So I have to wait for it for a little bit.
Yeah. I echo the feeling that I felt that Tinker got stuck there because he felt guilt about the accident. And it didn't seem like from the description that was something that he had a lot of blame for. Like it was bad conditions. There were, you should always be careful while driving, obviously, but like sometimes accidents happen. And then he just felt like he had to now take care of her. And her reaction to it was really hard to read. At the beginning, she was just depressed and unhappy, and then she kind of went for it, but you could see her like occasionally kind of poking Tinker in a way that made him keep doing this. And then, of course, eventually he proposes, and then she just flat turns him down and doesn't want to continue that anymore. Because she also had a contrarian energy that felt a lot like Hank, It's like she said, she didn't want to be under anybody's thumb. She could be under anything but not someone else's thumb. So she wanted to be independent, and it kind of felt like she was taking payment from Tinker for the accident. And then when we was getting to the point of proposing, then she was like, okay, that's enough. I don't want any more of this. I don't know.
Yeah, my take on Evie is that she was sort of an opportunist who was interested in going ahead in life and doing it as much as she could on her own. But I think she found when, life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And here she was in this accident. So she could almost leverage her entry into this next step up for a while, but until she herself could get away. So I feel like she was kind of using Tinker and his connections for her own advancement, which is going to be interesting when I read Even Hollywood to see if that type of opportunistic kind of streak continues with her, or if I'm maybe misreading it. But that was sort of, I know you said the story kind of lost some of its air when she left, but I was actually kind of glad to see her go. And I could then, focus on, and then whenever she would pop up again, like, when she was found drunk on the street and Katie had to go and bail her out, or when she called in the middle of the night pretending that I was like, oh, not her again.
Her and Katie's relationship was a little tough to gauge too. They loved each other, but also don't need to spend a lot of time with each other. Mm-hmm. At least once they got past that first point. But it was an interesting dynamic. A little weird. Do we have other points that we would like to cover? Or have we kind of talked ourselves out?
I've eaten to more than fullness at my sumptuous feast.
Okay, so final opinions. Is this a book you would recommend to others?
It's not, but I would not want it to be someone's one and only experience reading Amor Towles.
Okay.
Yeah.
So someone asked you about it, you'd be like, read this other one instead.
Yes, exactly.
What would you start someone with?
I will be saying more about that in a bit.
Okay. Well, then we don't have to pry further at the moment.
I would definitely recommend it. I'd say, hey, if someone, just randomly comes up to me and says, I'm looking for a good book, and if after a couple of questions, if I can get a sense that they're looking for a fiction that has good characters that will keep your attention, then this would definitely be something I would recommend to someone to read.
Yeah. I would recommend it to anyone who likes a historical fiction that isn't too heavy on the history, but gives a nice feel, and it's a pretty good read. I would call it a pretty good book. So with that, we will go on to our next segment called Can You Tell Me a Book I Would Also Like? Who would like to recommend? I think we want to go with Toby.
I think I have to go now.
Yeah.
So as I said, I would not want someone to read this book and be like, oh, okay, so that's what Amor Towles writes like. I'm good. Because this is my least favorite of his books. But my favorite book of his is The Lincoln Highway, which Trevor has read, so he can back me up on this. The Lincoln Highway is about a guy named Emmett, who he gets out of a juvenile reformatory, goes to collect his brother, grab his car, and head to California for a fresh start. However, Emmett's reformatory pals, Duchess and Woolley, show up needing a ride, and before Emmett knows it, they've stolen his car to go to New York, and Emmett has to go after them. And adventures ensue on all ends. Emmett and his brother hop a freight train, and Duchess is trying to find his dad. And it's such a good book. I think it puts Rules of Civility to shame, It's magical. And I think what Rules of Civility lacks in plot, The Lincoln Highway has plot in spades. The characters are wonderful. The writing is wonderful. I love that book so much. And I think a lot of people think his second book, Gentleman in Moscow, is his best, but I stand by The Lincoln Highway. It's wonderful.
Strong recommendation.
Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were reading Rules of Civility and you were thinking, I wish these people would get out of the city once in a while, Lincoln Highway is a road book, a train book, and it takes you places you're not expecting, and the characters are just as interesting, if not more so, and I think emotional payoffs are much bigger in Lincoln Highway. So 100% agree.
It's a good one.
Well, if you read Rules of Civility and you were thinking, boy, this is a great insight into a 20-something female, but written by an old white man, perhaps you might be interested in reading City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. Now, Elizabeth Gilbert, many of you will know from writing the book Eat, Pray, Love, but she also now writes fiction in addition to some nonfiction. So what City of Girls is about, it takes place in New York a little bit after the time period of Rules of Civility. So I think it's maybe the 1940s. It's still pre-war America. So it's virtually the same time period. And the story is, again, a woman looking back at her life from being an elderly person. So again, it has that sort of framing feature. It's about a woman who flunks out of college and so is sent by her wealthy parents down to live with their Aunt Peg in Manhattan, who runs a kind of a vaudeville theater in Midtown Manhattan. And so Vivian gets to meet all of these interesting characters, just like the interesting characters in Rules of Civility, like Olive, who is kind of like the older actress, and Celia, who's like the young debutante. And then what happens is, because it's during the war and the Blitz, there's quite a well-known British actress, Edna Parker Watson, and her husband, whose house gets bombed out in the Blitz. So they come across to New York, and are sort of a star draw. And so the next production that this theater puts on is called City of Girls. It's all about, again, the comings and goings and the misadventures of these people that run this theater in New York. And it's a delightful read, and I think people would enjoy it.
I'd co-sign that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I read a description of that book that called it like a big banana split of a novel, like it's just like a dessert, you know, it's just easy and fun and light and not
You might not like it
good for you.
Because it leans into a lot of the very flowery language and the excesses, but yeah.
Well, that's good to know, because that's the one I was going to recommend.
Oh, no.
Really?
Not because I've read it. It's because I haven't read anything quite like Rules of Civility. It's not my style of novels. So I was looking for recommendations, and City of Girls came up repeatedly. So I thought, well, I'll put this in, and thought that there was at least a 50% chance that one of you would recommend it. So you did. So I'm just hoping you didn't steal my nerd word too.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe you should go first for that one. No, you always like to go last.
I always like to go last, yeah.
That's right.
But yeah, I guess I'll co-sign on City of Girls then, even though I have not read it.
You could pretend that your book rec was The Great Gatsby. Because I'm surprised we haven't talked about that at all. I was thinking it's, Rules of Civility, it definitely owes its DNA to Great Gatsby. Like there's so many parallels, but we didn't even talk about that.
I don't even think I read Great Gatsby.
Whoa. I had to.
Okay, so I'm going to recommend that too.
Yeah.
Based on nothing but Trevor and Toby's reaction to it.
Because the segment is tell us about another book, not just tell us a book.
Can you tell me a book I would also like?
Yeah, so you've told us a book.
Yeah, that's true. I have fulfilled my contractual obligation. So in that case, we will now move on to everyone's favorite segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds, where we talk a bit about words or phrases we think are neat. Whose word is neat?
All right. Well, we were talking in the novel about how Katie liked to kind of try out different social stratas, going to fancy restaurants, but then also coming kind of back down to earth. And one of the places that Evie and Katie would eat in is something called an automat.
Yes.
And I didn't know what that was. And so I had to look it up. And so maybe others listening also don't know what it is. So it's a restaurant where people will get their food from vending machines that are replenished by a kitchen that is not in a public area. The first one of these opened in Berlin in 1895, and then the idea crossed the Atlantic, and the first one opened in New York City in 1912. One of the biggest franchises was called Horn and Hard Art, and at one time there were 40 of these automats in New York City. And it provided sort of a cheap alternative for people to go out and have a night out, but without the added expense of paying for servers, I guess. And they would take nickels, these machines, and they would have a cashier that you would go in and they'd give you change. So kind of like a video game arcade, but for food. And it was very popular sort of amongst the bohemian crowd, out-of-work actors, songwriters, and playwrights. They began to be threatened by the rise of fast food restaurants in the 1970s. That had a larger variety of payment options and food delivered over a counter, which some people preferred. Soon, fast food joints went out, and the last automat closed in 1991, and it was turned into a Burger King, which makes me sad. But since 1991, there have been attempts to revive the model, but with limited success. During COVID-19, you would think there might be a popularity with it with contactless dining. And in fact, a couple of businesses did start, but no, people preferred using like Uber Eats and Skip the Dishes. And so they haven't caught on again. But that's an automat.
Nice.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of nicknames in this book. Tinker, Bitsy, Dicky, Peaches, which seems like a very waspy rich person thing to do. And I came across this post on Blue Sky while I was reading this book, and it fit very well. So this comes from the Blue Sky account of Angus Johnston, who's a professor at the City University of New York. And he says, didn't we all know that Chip is a nickname for a guy named after his dad, Skip is a nickname for a guy named after his grandfather, and Trip is a name for a guy named after his dad and grandfather. So how this works is, so Chip is a nickname for a guy named after his dad because chip off the old block. Okay. Skip is a nickname for a guy named after his grandfather, skipped generation. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Trip is a name for a guy named after his dad and grandfather, Trip, having TRI, try, the third So I just thought that was very neat. It was not something I'd ever heard before. I'm sure this is not necessarily always the case, but it feels like one of those little like waspy secrets that now we all know.
You know, my mom had a cousin that I've only known as Skippy. So I'm going to check with her, see if that perhaps might be where you guys came from.
Yeah.
Could also be just that he liked peanut butter. Yeah.
I will report back.
That is a very interesting
really
word
cool.
thing. So my word comes from the book and comes from a scene where Katie and Fran, a.k.a. Peaches, meet Grub and Hank's group in that one bar. Katie kind of wants to leave, so she tells Fran that she'd like to mosey along. So my word is mosey. As the English language is wont to do, Merriam-Webster gives like two slightly contradictory definitions for mosey. The first sense is to hurry away, while the second sense is to move in a leisurely or aimless manner. It's the second sense that I'm more familiar with, based on my experience, but according to Merriam-Webster, the etymological origin of the word is unclear, but it's been used in the first sense since at least 1829. The saying mosey along is defined as just leaving, and so I guess it doesn't really say whether you're leaving slowly or quickly. But anyways, I like the word. I like the relaxed feel of it. So mosey. And with that, we can mosey along to our conclusion, because that, unfortunately, is all the time we have for this month. Thank you so much for joining us, dear readers. For our next episode, we're going to read and discuss Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Authors June Hayward and Athena Liu were supposed to be twin rising stars, but Athena's a literary darling. June Hayward is literally nobody. Who wants stories about basic white girls, June thinks. So when June witnesses Athena's death in a freak accident, she acts on impulse. She steals Athena's just-finished masterpiece, an experimental novel about the unsung contributions of Chinese laborers during World War I. So what if June edits Athena's novel, sends it to her agent as her own work? So what if she lets her new publisher rebrand her as Juniper Song, complete with an ambiguously ethnic author photo? Doesn't this piece of history deserve to be told, whoever the teller? That's what June claims, and the New York Times bestseller list seems to agree. But June can't get away from Athena's shadow, and emerging evidence threatens to bring June's stolen success down around her. As June races to protect her secret, she discovers exactly how far she will go to keep what she thinks she deserves. Have comments or book suggestions for us? Send us an email. You can find all our contact info at the bottom of the page at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca. You can also find all our past episodes there too. If you haven't already, subscribe to Time to Read on your favorite podcasting service and maybe leave us a review. Tell your book-loving friends about us too. And until next time, make sure you find time to read.
All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I ever really need is a little more time to read.
Okay, we're in a literary mindset now, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to use any of this for the post roll either.
I was going to check which one of the 110 rules of civility involve.
I think we broke all of them just now.
I didn't actually read through the rules.
Oh, yeah,
either, like the Washington one.
Yeah, they're in
they're
the back.
pretty boring.
Best part is the funny spelling on some of them.
Yeah, those founding fathers may have been clever, but they couldn't spell, could they?
like using the word shoe instead of show, like SHEW.
It's a really big shoe. That's why he said it that way.